This is our last session of the day, but very interesting session. We have 4 panelists plus a moderator. This session is called Policy Relevance and Decision Making in Energy Modeling, Balancing Short-Term and Long-Term Goals for Policymaker. Before we proceed, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge another important sponsor, ESMIA Consultant. They sponsor this session. A very special thanks to Kathleen Vaillancourt, President and founder of ESMIA, for her support. Kathleen is also involved in the EMH advisory board as well, and she contributes to all our discussion. I encourage everyone to meet with Kathleen and her team in the Pacific Room, where they have a booth with Institut d'Énergie Trottier. So for this session, I'm pleased to welcome back to the stage Hassami Miketa, Head of Energy Transition Planning and Power Sector Transformation at IRENA, and our esteemed co-host for this event. Hassami will be moderating this session, and hopefully, please help me in welcoming Hassami to the stage.
So please come forward, the panelists. I think we have 3 panelists in here and 1 panelist online. So let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker is Paul Dean, Senior Lecturer, University of College Cork, who is joining online. Hi, Paul. And then we have Ezzat Jalloudi. He's a Project Lead, Environment and Climate Division from City of Toronto. And then we have Peter Johnston, Economic Advisor, Integrated Climate Lens Center of Expertise. He's from the Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then finally, Jean-Denis Charlevoix. He's a Chief Economist and Canada Energy Regulator. So this session is a little bit shorter, so each speaker have 15 minutes to present, and then we have 15 minutes for question and answer session. So with that, first I would like to invite Paul to give his first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sami. Bonjour tout le monde. En fait, bonne nuit bonsoir parce que c'est la nuit ici en Irlande. Malheureusement, je ne peux pas être là avec vous à Ottawa ce soir, mais j'espère que la prochaine fois, je serai capable de voyager. Et merci aussi Kathleen et l'équipe ESMIA, IRENA aussi, pour l'invitation pour parler avec vous. My name is Paul Dean. I'm a senior researcher at University College Cork. We're a university, but we're a little bit different because we operate a kind of like a consultancy. We provide direct technical assistance to the government here in Ireland. And I really want to focus in on the 2 words here, I guess, in my presentation: policy relevance and decision making. We have been working in this space for about 10 years now. That gives us 10 years of experience, but it also allows me to share 10 years worth of mistakes. So I'm going to try and share with you some of the lessons that we have learned. My presentation is a little bit different. It really focuses on, I suppose, the advice and some of the experiences that are maybe useful to share with you about policy relevance and decision making. We started this journey in Ireland about 10 years ago using the Times model. We developed the first low carbon roadmap for Ireland, and ever since then we've done lots of reports, lots and lots of stuff. I'm not going to bore you or overwhelm you with any of this wonderful stuff, but let me start by the first thing I learned when I moved from academia into this policy making space is that policymakers are really busy. They're also really intelligent. So I hope there are some policymakers in the room at the moment listening to this, because it's nice to hear people say nice things about you. But you're intelligent people, but you're incredibly busy. So a big part of our community in terms of modeling is not just focusing on the technical details of the model, but how can we communicate it? How can we explain it in a way that's relevant, that's useful, and that's digestible for policymakers? So a lot of my time these days is making these sort of things. And apologies, there's an error on the slide here. One of these images is shown twice. But we spend an awful lot of time writing these 1-page policy briefs. So the first lesson that we learned the hard way when dealing with policymakers is typically the longer the report, the less impact it has. So keep it brief, keep it short. It must be something that a policymaker can read and digest in about 20 minutes. Remember, these are incredibly sharp people, but they're busy. A friend of mine who works in the policy making space over in Europe with the European Commission, she often tells me, we don't need more people coming to tell us that we need to install more renewables, that we need more EVs, that we need to reduce fossil fuels. They know that already, but what they're struggling with is, how do you do that? So for us, from a policy relevance perspective, it's really helpful and useful if we can explain how things can be done. So lesson number 2 that we learned, again, the hard way, was don't tell policymakers stuff that they know already. Try and be different and communicate something that's useful. And again, these policy briefs are something that we distill lots of complex information down, hopefully into useful bite-sized nuggets that they can operationalize and take action on. And remember, we must appreciate that the energy and climate literacy of some decision makers isn't as good as ours. You know, they don't have the time that we have to look into all of this stuff. So we have to be careful in how we communicate it. It has to be robust, it has to be precise, and it has to be meaningful. One of the things that we spend a lot of time focusing on is how we communicate. And many of you who are modelers will be familiar with this saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This same famous George Box saying, but we would say, well, all modelers are wrong, but some of us are quite useful. Whether you agree with that or not, that's difficult to say, to know. But a big part of our community is not just focusing on the technical details of the model itself, but also focusing on the modeling as a practice. So we tend to overemphasize the role of numerical methods when we talk about modeling, and we underestimate the importance of the practice of what we do as modelers ourselves. And the analogy I give to my students is that it's like having a really powerful racing car, but if you're not a good driver, you're not able to get the best out of that car. And in the same way, if you're not good at understanding the techniques of the modeling, well, then the model is relatively useless. So a big part of our education with policymakers and with people working in decision making is asking the right questions, not only of the model, but of the modelers themselves, and being able to share that, the strengths, the weaknesses, the positives, the negatives of the modeling, because that's fundamentally important in terms of the credibility of our practice and the techniques that we use. We tend, you know, I come from a strong academic, from a strong academic background, and at a lot of the, I suppose, the modeling work, we tend to really focus in on numerical methods, and that's okay. But we must be able to communicate to policymakers the world that the model sees. So when we're communicating to decision makers, we're always very careful to distinguish whether we're using simulation techniques or optimization techniques. And that's important because optimization techniques reflect the world that we wished we lived in, whereas simulation techniques reflect the world that we do live in. And that's important. We heard a lot talk about net zero today, about carbon budgets, about decarbonization. But optimization models make things look really easy. Optimizations assume grid can be built. They assume behaviors will change. And as we've heard from Charlie earlier on in the earlier session, that's not always the case. So when we're communicating to decision makers and policymakers, it's really important to get across the architecture that our model sees. We say it's an important social duty of our community to communicate the differences between the numerical world that the model sees and the real world, because that gives us credibility. And if something looks very easy in a model, we can almost guarantee that in the real world, that's very challenging. And this is important because it's not to highlight the weaknesses of our model, but it's to ensure that policymakers can understand the results coming out. Because if you can understand the results, you understand where the risks are. If you know where the risks are, you can manage and mitigate them. And if you can manage and mitigate them, you can keep costs down. And that means you have a better chance of delivering the future that we all need and all want in terms of decarbonization. So that's a really important element when you're communicating. Well, our lesson that we have learned when communicating with decision makers. Decision makers aren't as interested in as us as modelers in terms of whether it's mixed integer or Lagrangian relaxation. That's kind of fun stuff to talk about after a conference, but in terms of policy relevance, it isn't very high up in terms of moving policy along or shaping policy or informing policy. But it's our duty to explain it, what it means in terms of real world. My next point sounds very simple, but it's actually very important. And sometimes the simple things can be very, very true. But we have to make sure that our results are right. We have to make sure that our results are good. Giving poorly informed results, not only does it damage the reputation of us as modelers, but it can also be very costly in terms of poor policy making or poor policy decisions. So we always try and get our researchers and our modelers working here to try and anticipate and evaluate the answer that they're going to get before they execute a model. So we always say a model should be used, like we do experiments in science. You should make a hypothesis. What will the power system look like in a decarbonized power system or a net zero scenario? We should do thought experiments to inform that hypothesis, maybe take it off model, do some whiteboarding, do some brainstorming, and then we should use our model to either accept or reject a hypothesis that we have come up with. And this is really important. There is a tendency in the age now of artificial intelligence to forget that human intelligence matters an awful lot as well. And rather than blindly accepting what the computer says is the answer, we have to be more robust, we have to be more rigorous, and we have to be more thought out in terms of how we communicate that. Because they are the types of questions that policymakers and decision makers will want to understand. And one of the things I think that we have found very helpful in terms of communicating with decision makers is to ask the question, well, what would change our results the most? And that is really important information for policymakers to understand. Again, if we're looking at decarbonization of the transport sector, what is the thing that matters most in terms of delivering that? Is it uncertainty around finance? Is it charging points? Is it the cost of batteries? And again, that's really important for policymakers to know, because if our research can identify risks, they can be mitigated, managed, and they can be financially accounted for. And that is really important. So one of the things when we are communicating with policymakers, what we always try and do, we present a suite of results, very concise, very clear, very short. And remember, policymakers are pretty sharp people. They typically want to know whether results are north or south of a certain answer. But we always communicate the element that would change the results the most, because that's the thing where the uncertainty needs to be managed. And that's very useful from a policy relevance decision and very, very helpful. Again, in terms of modeling, when we're talking to policymakers and decision makers about how wonderful our models are, it's important to be able to distinguish whether the results that are coming out of our model, are they driven by the architecture of the model that we're using, or are they driven by the data that we're absorbing into that model? And this is very important. A lot of the research that we're doing over here in Europe at the moment, we're using synthetic data sets and synthetic solar sets to inform future wind profiles, future solar profiles, and that's good. But they have a smoothing effect. And that smoothing effect can overvalue the role of storage and maybe undervalue the role of interconnection. And that's okay. But being able to understand it and being able to communicate it is really, really important, particularly in the context of policy communication. And so it's really important that when we're doing different scenarios, that we try and dampen the noise coming from our models as much as possible, so we get clear signals around the sensitivity. And that's really important because it distinguishes the difference between knowing the answer and understanding the answer. Anybody can know the answer to something, but from what policymakers want to know is, do you understand the answer? Can we share that understanding? And again, it comes back to the job that they are tasked with. If they understand the future that we are portraying, if they understand the risks and the uncertainties, they can target measures, target policy around those risks. And that is really, really important. And again, an important social duty of our community to communicate and to deal with that. The last couple of points, again, coming to the I suppose the academic background that a lot of modelers have. We get very excited about complexity in models. We love this kind of stuff, mixed integer, linear programming, all this kind of stuff. But the value of complexity isn't always useful, particularly when you're dealing in longer term decisions. It has a real need and necessity, I think, in short-term modeling, particularly in power systems, where we follow very deterministic rules of physics. But in the longer term decision making, out 20, 30 years, where human nature dominates the decision making process rather than mother nature, the value of complexity is probably diminished. And particularly in long-term models, looking out into the future, we find the value of curiosity rather than complexity is more important. And what I mean by the value of curiosity is, rather than adding more detail into your model about the specifics of a power system or a transport network, instead of doing that, do lots of different scenarios. Do hundreds of scenarios in the future. Do hundreds of fuel prices, carbon prices, policy implementations, and see what the commonality is coming across those scenarios. Is there a common thread that's robust and resilient to all these futures? And again, from a policy-making perspective, to know that is very powerful, because that allows you to understand what are the least regret options, what are low regret options. And that is really, really, really important. So again, it's important to reflect and understand on the usefulness that complexity is adding to our models. And often, simple reduced form models, back of the envelope, Excel sheets, again, making an experiment for the future, check your hypothesis and validate it with your model. So we shouldn't get too excited about complexity into the future, because it tends to diminish and is eroded by the many uncertainties that are in around the world and in around our life. And finally, well, the second last point, the other thing that we've learned a lot, and again, learned the hard way, your results must be right. Modeling is complex, it's hard, it's tiring. You folks have been in a room all day listening to modelers. Imagine modeling all day. It's easy to make errors. And for me, most of my errors happen when I'm tired and distracted. Always before we present work to policymakers, the decision makers, we let it sit for a couple of days. We come back to it with fresh eyes. We get a bit of fresh air, and we get different people to look at it. That's so important for capturing very simple errors in modeling. And that may sound like a very benign point. It might sound like not a very useful point, but trust me, looking at stuff with fresh eyes can be invaluable when it comes to the breadth and the complexity of the type of modeling that we are dealing with, and particularly before you go public with it. Once it goes out there into the public space, into policymakers' desk, it's out there, and it's very difficult to get it back. And often getting a different perspective on your modeling results is incredibly healthy thing to do. It's an incredibly useful thing to have, and it's very, very, it amplifies, I suppose, the policy relevance of the work. And finally, my last point is a nice point. It's we have to be kind. A lot of us out there are working with models. We're dealing with government, we're dealing with regulators, academics, and organizations. There's always going to be mistakes in modeling. If we didn't have mistakes and if we were always right, we wouldn't be having workshops like we are today. The future would be very boring and it would be very predictable. It isn't. It's exciting, but that means there's always going to be challenges in modeling. There's always going to be things that we dislike coming from our results and other results. But be kind. We have to create a community of trust and transparency in terms of how we model. And this is how we grow, this is how we develop, and this is how we improve our practice. No model is perfect. No modeler is always right. And from our experience here in Ireland, there is a huge benefit in sharing results with your community and supporting each other in how to improve it, because ultimately that allows us to supply decision makers and policymakers with the best evidence to make the best decisions in the future. So I'll finish, Asami, on a very altruistic and high note by asking us all to be kind when we are sharing our results with the public. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing the insights based on your experience and your lessons learned. Now I would like to ask Ezat to share your experience based on your work at City of Toronto.
Hello. So I'm here today to tell you about the lens model that the City of Toronto has developed as a tool to guide implementation of the net zero strategy and to develop short-term and long-term policies. I'm going to start off by a brief outline, introducing to you the City of Toronto's net zero strategy and some background history about it. I will go in more details about the lens model, how it came to be, and what are the components. And finally, I'll finish off with some insights from the lens model as a tool to guide policy making. So the work on the net zero strategy started in 2015 under the name of Climate Action Strategy, where the goals were to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050 from 1990 levels. So this was adopted by the City Council in 2017, but 2 years later, City Council declared a climate emergency where they set a target of net zero by 2040 and an intermediate target of 65% reductions from 1990 levels by 2030. That's when work started on the new version, which was now became Transform TO's net zero strategy. I'll be referring to it as net zero strategy simply. And there was technical analysis done using the City Insight model. A year later, the City Council adopted this Transform net zero strategy. So here we are 2 years later, with less than 17 years to go. You can see that so much has changed during those 6 to 8 years previous to today. And we know that history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. So we know that during those next 17 years, things are going to change a lot. So as part of the technical analysis that was done for the net zero strategy, there were 4 different pathways identified. The first is the do nothing, also known as business as usual scenario, the business as planned scenario, the net zero by 2050, and net zero by 2040. You can see that between 2025 and 2030, there's a very critical period where most of the reductions happen. And another thing that you notice is that in order to reach net zero, we really have to have a zero carbon grid. The strategy also identified 5 critical steps and some more detailed short-term and long-term actions to achieve the goals. So the first critical step is to create a carbon accountability and carbon budget framework. Reduction in natural gas has to be accelerated. Building performance targets must be established. The city has to increase low carbon transportation options as well as increase local renewable energy generation and storage. There's also other factors on which the success of the net zero strategy depends. With time running out, action must begin now and it must focus on equity. There has to be alignment between the actions and the policies of different levels of government. I mentioned this earlier, but we need a carbon-free electricity system. There's the labor market that must shift and the supply chains must be developed to adapt to the demand. Innovative and adaptive delivery mechanisms have to be scaled up, and there has to be consideration given to the material and land. So to support the implementation of the net zero strategy, this is where the city set out to develop its own open source model. There were 5 main requirements for the model. First, it had to be an open source model, with Python being a preferred coding language, and this is to promote transparency, accountability, and allow for opportunities to collaborate. The second requirement was that it has to be an optimization model with an objective function to minimize costs. Third requirement was that it had to provide detailed spatial and temporal modeling. I was going to explain a little bit about capacity expansion models and production cost models, but we had a very good presentation earlier this morning. So we needed two different models to achieve that. And because capacity expansion models and production cost models operate at different temporal and spatial resolution, there had to be, as a fourth requirement, a linking tool to connect both of these models. Finally, the model had to be user-friendly and use something like Excel-based sheets as input and output, and had to come with technical and non-technical supporting material of manuals and videos. So how is this model different from the previous work that was done? So the first iteration of the net zero strategy using the city inside model was a great start. It gave us broad and spatial temporal analysis, which was good to facilitate planning and develop some policies, but it was limited as it couldn't provide very high time resolution information to answer questions about peak load demands. So the new model, on the other hand, will be an optimization model, which minimizes for cost. It looks at both high temporal and high spatial resolution to give us the requirements to look at how the energy system will develop and evolve over time, as well as being able to meet the demand of peak loads. Finally, it will be an open source model. So working with ESMIA and with the guidance of a technical advisory group, when the project was completed, there were 3 deliverables that came out of it. A set of models, I will come back to those in a second. The documentation, which I mentioned, were a requirement of the project, and a case study to showcase the capabilities of the model. So the set of models were the capacity expansion model, which was given the name TIMOA-TO, the production cost model, Silver-TO, and the linking tool. So starting with the TIMOA-TO, we used the -TO to differentiate it from the source model, TIMOA, which was modified to meet the characteristics of the City of Toronto. And this model will be look at how the energy system will evolve over time. Now, the interesting thing about this model, it can be used in 3 different modes. One of them is the policy-based mode, where the policies that are being suggested are used as input for the model, and you get the energy system that will come out under those different policies. There's a target-based mode where you set GHG emission targets as a constraint, and then the model will provide you with one of the versions of the energy system that will get you to meet those targets. And finally, there's a hybrid model where you can use both policies and GHG emission targets as input to see what the optimal energy system would look like. The second model is the linking tool. As I explained, the role of the linking tool is to connect TIMOA-TO and Silver-TO. So what the linking tool does is it takes the output from TIMOA and then disaggregates it spatially and temporally to determine what the demand of electricity from the grid will be, and that will be used as input for the Silver-TO model. Finally, the Silver-TO model is also an adaptation of the Silver model, same as TIMOA. It was modified for the City of Toronto, and it takes the output of the linking tool and determines the electric loads that will be transmitted through the grid. And that's done at an hourly resolution. Now I'm going to move to some of the examples of the outputs that you can get out of the different models of Lens. So starting with the high-level outputs that you can get from TIMOA, it can tell you how the GHG emissions will evolve over time and what the contribution of every sector will be. It can provide financial analysis in the form of cumulated investment cost over the different years. It can also provide what the energy mix will be like at different times of from the years between now and 2040. It can also provide more specific outputs with higher granularity. So it can provide sector-specific information, for example, the contribution of different types of buildings to the emissions. It can also give you what the different technologies are, which will make up your system in the future. As for the linking tool, it can give you what your energy demand is going to be and where that energy will be coming from, whether it's from distributed energy resources or from the grid. And it can also tell you what is going to make up that demand. Is it going to be just regular electrification of homes, or is it related to battery charging or EV charging? Finally, the output that you can get from SilverTO is a very high-level summary of the state of the grid under the projected energy system, and it can also provide line by line at an hourly resolution details of the loads. The different outputs can even be used to do further analysis. So using the outputs, you can look at the resilience of the grid and how peak loads will be shifting as electricity demand increases. You can look at energy affordability and how much subsidies would be required to support individuals and residents that may be at risk of energy poverty. I think another example that was Elisabetta mentioned a little bit earlier, it's how much subsidies you might need to pay out to support the different residents install distributed energy resources in their homes and buildings. And you can also use it for job projections. It can also be used to run sensitivity analysis using different scenarios to determine how factors that are outside the jurisdiction of the City of Toronto, that the city has no control of, could affect the net zero strategy progress and how resilient it is to those different factors. So to wrap up, I will go back to those 5 critical steps and the actions that are required, as well as the different factors on which the success of the net zero strategy depends. And hopefully through the examples that I showed to you, you can see how Lens will be a tool to define short-term and long-term policies for the net zero strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezad, for giving us the excellent overview of the Lens model. Now I would like to invite Peter Johnston from the ECCC. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to want to first off by thanking the EMH and Irina for inviting me to be here today. I know it's been a long day talking about the complexities of the electricity grid as well as models. I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about the complexities of the federal government instead. So this discussion is going to be on modeling for informed decision-making and kind of my new team in terms of integrating climate lens acting as a bridge to support this. So I want to start off by painting a little bit of a picture on the complex environment that we're currently working in for policymaking and how economy and energy modeling kind of fits into this space before kind of broadening out and looking at the additional policy constraints that need to be considered across federal government decision-making on climate, as well as some affordability concerns as we get more into, let's say, bridging the gap amongst the modelers, as well as with the modelers and those who are currently working as decision makers. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of call to action that Edward actually put in my mind when I was thinking about this presentation. So there is a very complex climate policy landscape that we're currently operating in. As you may have seen last week, there's a lot of new policies, regulations, and plans that came out as Canada's currently engaging at COP in Dubai. So how can we integrate net zero modeling to support decisions along a pathway. And as we've heard today, we've had variations in the level of governments that are here, such as provincial and territorial cooperation that the federal government needs to collaborate with. Then we also have on the international stage, how does Canada fit into the world stage and in designing and implementing policies to ensure that we remain competitive while working at home. And for this, Canada has developed many plans, strategies, and frameworks to address the policy crisis that we're currently undergoing. We've seen the emission reduction plan, and more recently last week with the progress report that came out, the National Adaptation Strategy in 2022, looking at how we can adapt to the growing number of adverse weather conditions that are happening, as well as the Global Biodiversity Framework signed in Montreal of last year, and how we can support nature along this pathway. So as kind of mentioned, this is a very complex space where we're trying to use many levers that we can to address all the concerns. And this is compounded by the fact that across the federal government, there's many departments that each have their own mandates that they need to comply with, as well as the authorities that they have at their disposal in order to enact incentivized change. And this cannot be possible without partnering with Indigenous groups to ensure that they are brought along with us and alongside the different policies and programs that are being developed. If you look at the news anytime today, you'll see that there's a lot of affordability concerns. And this is both at the cost side as well as ensuring that they have a viable space to live in. And one of the things that we hear regularly, and we're talking about regulations, is the long-term aspect of them. There's a lot of funding proposals that are only looking at a few years and how we can use those at certain times to look at the longer-term transitions that do occur, while not forgetting adaptation, resilience, and biodiversity. As I work at Environment and Climate Change Canada, that's one of our key components that we need to consider every day. So what is the Integrated Climate Lens? So we're a relatively new tool that came out in 2021. We're initially announced in the Strengthening Climate Plan and released in December 2020, looking at how can we integrate economy and climate considerations into one lens to support government decision making. So we've kind of evolved a little bit since those initial days. There's a pandemic that happened along the way, and that we're currently acting as an assessment framework as part of the larger picture, aiming to ensure that major cabinet decision making, so when you're trying to get policy cover, as you're asking for funds for programs, to consider climate change, environment, and nature alongside economic impacts. And when we're thinking about climate change, we are thinking about emission mitigation, adaptation, as well as resilience in a package. And as I'm kind of going through this presentation, I'm going to use the word proposal as it kind of signifies a new or renewed policy, program, or regulation, and saying all that is a mouthful. So the objectives here are to ensure that climate and environmental implications are considered early and throughout the entire policy design process, and not done at the end of this day. So that when we're designing policies, these considerations are brought in, decision makers understand them, everyone can be on board, and as the programs are ultimately rolled out, that they're taking into account. As I mentioned, we've been around for 2 years, so we're still learning as we're growing, and we're hoping to roll out beyond 7 departments into the new year. We're currently focusing on the more environmental considered departments as we broaden our reach. So within this, and what connecting more to this audience, is we're going to focus on GHG estimation. So within this, there's a lot of linkages with the energy system, and how does emissions kind of are estimated for different proposals and linkages with energy. As we've kind of seen over the last few years, there's been a lot of external groups that have called out the federal government on this. We've seen that the Net Zero Advisory Body, as well as the Commissioner for Environmental and Sustainable Development, have come out indicating that they want to improve the transparency of GHG estimation, both at the economy-wide side and then also at the more proposal level. So within my team, we're currently working with other departments to support this discussion and kind of bringing together, having conversations and developing methods in order to ensure that the data that is available can be made public, how we can bring together analyses to use them in a way that makes decision-making coherent. And that, so when we're looking at the group of within this room and within the federal government, we have the modelers who are working across departments and across groups. How can we bring them together to have conversations and then make sure that that group is communicating with the decision makers so everyone is on the same page to understand what is going on so that no one is left behind on this way. So as we've talked today a lot about modelers, one thing I just want to highlight, we're not modelers and we're not policymakers. We're kind of acting as a bridge in between the two of them, and we do this through supporting organizational capacity building, kind of enabling departments to undertake the best analysis they can with the tools that they have at their disposal, and where possible, trying to elevate these with a community outreach and understanding. And one of the things that we do very regularly is wanting to look at how public servants think through their proposal, how it affects the climate, and then in the other direction, how does the climate affect the proposal? As we're seeing more adverse weather conditions happening with wildfires this year, designing policies that can withstand these adverse effects, ensure that Canadians are getting the resources they need. So within this, kind of going back to the more on the GHG side, we are really focusing on building capacity and not an electricity generation capacity, but when we're looking at it, we're looking at the skills and capabilities of departments and those working within their space that are currently trying to develop the pathways and programs to move forward so that it's integrated in a coherent way. As we're relatively new, we do need to think about how we're setting us up in the short term, as well as the longer term, as 2030, 2035, and 2050 are going to come up on us quickly as we're looking to transition the economy to a net zero electricity grid and the net zero economy at large. So part of the way we're doing this is through offering guidance and socializing principles of openness, transparency, as well as like understanding there's uncertainty in all this and how we can communicate in a way to move forward amongst a broad community that has very different skill sets and ensuring that all the considerations are brought in. And part of that is through the awareness and transparency that we're having today, as well as with policymakers when we're doing that. So in the long term, GHG estimation is consistent, robust, transparent, and that there's collaboration within government and with the public as well. And as possible, there's the availability of data and estimation tools are available so others can look into so we can improve collaboratively. Go back one. So, all right, different slides. So I just want to take a little bit of a step back. As we're talking about the diverse group of departments and mandates, we did a survey back in 2022, looking at the different GHG estimation tools across departments. We identified 22 different tools used across various departments. There was around 7 that participated in this. And the needs and the skill sets that each of them developed was unique. We kind of have NRCan looking more at the specific transitions of some of the electricity sector, oil and gas, where we have agriculture focusing more on farmer and land use, and how we can use these together, and understanding that as these different tools are fit for purpose, we want to encourage that to continue, so that when there is a need, they can look at the tools and use them, but understanding what others are doing and how we can use them in together. For those who are looking, I can share it after, as maybe a little challenging to read on the screen. So using these together, that we can create a coherent picture and then feed into the longer term 2030 and 2050 economy-wide modeling so we can get into the nitty-gritty. Because we do recognize that the weakness of one tool tends to be the strength of another, and we need to use them together. We've heard a lot today about the different tools and models that electricity operators are using in order to ensure that the electricity grid is reliable and it's economically efficient. So how we can move forward to use that in the context is something we really want, as there is a diverse mandates across government to feed into a singular objective. And part of the way we do this, so this one switches and that one doesn't. There we go. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So part of the way we want to do this is to bring together modelers. We understand that there's a lot of groups that are working together, but a lot of the times they're not communicating effectively. We see this as we've moved to an online world, that people are working within their teams, but they're not having the cross collaboration that we'd ideally want in order to overcome some of the challenges that each team are doing and that we can only overcome together. So we want to bring the modelers together to discuss both their methods, the results, and challenges they're facing in order to come up with collective solutions. The Energy Modeling Hub is a perfect example of this, bringing together folks for the last 2 years to address kind of the electricity concerns. And we want to broaden this out to look at other sectors and the ways and the needs that they have, so that there's an open, flowing, and trusting communication streams, and it's done in a way to elevate and be constructive and not take away from the analysis that is being done, recognizing that models have their own constraints and limitations, and understanding that, communicating that, rather than treating it as a feature of the model rather than a deficit, but having the conversation around that and being open with it so people can understand how to do this. And part of that is, as we're developing these longer term trajectories, understanding where future proposals may come from, and then allowing that early engagement so that we can do it in a coherent, consistent way and develop and overcome the challenges on it so we can provide the best analysis we can, and that the niche analysis areas that each group are undertaking continues to operate and flourish in this, not taking away from that, but encouraging that, letting all flowers bloom, so to speak. So, as we've kind of been talking about bringing the modelers together and understanding we, within the integrated climate lens, are not modelers or policymakers, we need to bridge the gap between the modeling teams and the policymakers. Effective communication is vital between these two groups to make sure that the analysis is being used, the nuances are being understood and not put to a footnote that is later forgotten, because this is where the true results lie. And that we can do this through providing guidance as well as iterative reviews through proposal design process. So when it gets to the end of the day, everyone is on the same page with what is being done. And part of this begins with having a common language. So we've recently worked alongside 3 external academics to develop climate literacy courses that we've sent out to public servants, with applying climate literacy foundations, contributing to a net zero economy, and adapting to a changing climate in Canada as a way to, say, increase the floor for those who are not working in the climate space and need to improve their understanding. People within this room may understand electricity well and climate, but as we get further into departments that their mandates are fundamentally different, ensuring that they have the knowledge and capabilities in order to ensure that these are taken into account. And part of this is through broad awareness and promotion as a key activity. So as kind of alluded to, we want to ensure that Canadians can rely on climate-informed considerations in government decision-making. Canada's public service will provide, promote, and participate in climate literacy training targeted at all levels, including the executive level, to improve their understanding and with this. And as people may have heard at COP already, Canada pledged to have 30,000 public servants trained in climate literacy by the time they reconvene next year. So I want to look out of the crowd, and I want you to challenge yourself to build and participate in community as a core value of energy and economy modeling, be it through sharing documentations, having discussions, undertaking sensitivity analysis, and engaging more broadly, consider community in all your work. Let's leverage this moment to reaffirm a commitment and emphasize guiding principles of transparency and open communication to fortify community bonds to achieve a resilient net zero Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for introducing us the very interesting integrated climate lens and explaining how this bridges the policymakers and modeling community and building capacity within the department. So finally, we have John Denny from the Canada Energy Regulator. John Denny, the floor is yours.
Merci à Samy et merci aussi au Carrefour de modélisation sur l'énergie, Edouard et Normand. Grateful for the platform that you offer us again this year. And also basically taking the inclusivity to a different angle with a multi-generational attendance here in light of the teacher strike in Quebec. I had the pleasure to bring my daughter with me, and Juliette. Now's the time to remove your headphones if you hear me. And she's not, so no chance. Also grateful for the opportunity to address the crowd here from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people by the Ottawa River. It's always a pleasure to come into the National Capital Region. So you've heard about many modeling perspectives throughout the day, both at a sectoral level. I recall this afternoon after lunch, the presentation about buildings. We heard from the City of Toronto and many others. And this afternoon, acknowledging that I stand between you and the reception, right at the very tail end of the day, I will not speak about the modeling results that we've had at the Canada Energy Regulator in the context of our net zero modeling, but rather explain to you where we sit within the federal family and also how we go about the modeling that we do so that hopefully our modeling informs policymaking and is also part of the mosaic of information that is available out there to policymakers. And I say mosaic with a purposeful way because, as some of you will know, in the investment world, there's the mosaic theory that actually goes about informing a decision maker with all of the available information before making a decision rather than relying on a single source of information. I think this is what policymakers have as an opportunity here, acknowledging the wealth and the growing energy modeling space that exists in Canada and internationally, to not rely on a single model or a single piece of information, but rather open their minds and look at the collective body of knowledge and work that is out there, understand the limitations of each and the purpose of each, and also acknowledge where each organization sits and when they conduct their modeling exercise, and use that information into their decision making. So you'll hear in the next couple of minutes topics about policy alignment, transparency, as well as the engagement that we do at the CR through our modeling and energy information work. So let's get going. So at the CR, we are obviously the regulator for Canada's energy infrastructure that are under federal jurisdiction. We work to ensure that infrastructure is safe and efficient in terms of delivering energy to Canada and the world. It's about protecting the environment, recognizing and respecting the rights of Indigenous people, and also, and this is where the emphasis here for this afternoon, is providing timely and relevant energy information and analysis, i.e. squarely part of our mandate as part of an expert energy regulator that has 4 core responsibilities. One is about energy adjudication, where the Commission makes a quasi-judicial decision on energy projects. That includes, yes, pipelines, and also international power lines, and also potentially, depending if inter-provincial power lines are ever designated. This is an option that policymakers have to designate inter-provincial power lines. That has not been exercised so far, but this is an option that exists so that it is under the CR jurisdiction. So if a project is approved and built, then our organization will also oversee the safety and security and environmental protection of those facilities. We do so as well through purposeful engagement throughout, and that is also included into our work that I'll speak about later on a slide about our energy information core responsibility, the green box, that is about providing timely and relevant information to Canadians. This is obviously done through our Energy Futures report that many of you will be familiar with. We also publish bi-weekly market snapshots, provincial and territories profile, and also work alongside policymakers depending on events that affect the energy system. Think about the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, depending on also climate events, floods, forest fires that may impact the energy system. We are well positioned to inform policymaking in that context. So where are we positioned? So we are basically within the the Energy and Natural Resources Canada portfolio under Minister Wilkinson as an arm's length regulator. So this means that we are independent, not only in decision making for regulatory purposes, which is its own type of adjudicative independence, and we are also arm's length from an energy information perspective in terms of the CR being accountable for the analysis that it makes, while at the same time being informed and also aligned from a policy perspective with where the federal government is going, where the global energy policy dialogue is going as well. We report to Parliament through the Minister of Natural Resources. And our work of not only energy information, but also energy modeling is grounded into the Act, where there are specific provisions that talk about the regulator must study and keep under review matters related to energy, and that the regulator must inform and provide advice upon request to the minister. The minister has been relatively active in that space, asking us effectively to model net zero back in 2021. The minister has also been active in February 2003, providing us a framework for the organization as a whole, including energy information, where there was an expectation where we would provide information regarding renewables, clean fuels, as well as non-emitting energy. So as you can see, this is done in a transparent manner, and identifying the topics that the minister is interested to hear about without actually constraining the manner in which we go about this, nor the actual outcome or the actual results that the analysis ought to result in. And this is, I think, a value added in terms of allowing policymakers to put requests and also giving the CR the space to conduct the analysis, thereby preserving a degree of independence in space, which we think adds credibility to the federal system in terms of the energy information and the analysis that gets produced. So if we look through the years, we see that we've taken an iterative approach through the modeling that we have done. Obviously, energy futures date back to 1967. And if we zoom since 2007, or rather the establishment of the Kyoto Protocol in 2005, that set the stage essentially for us to go into a more, I'll say, a more comprehensive scenarios where we would, for example, in 2007, modeled a scenario where there was a balance between the environment, the economy, as well as the energy the world needs. Then when we look at the green box at the bottom, we see, so the Paris Agreement in 2015 setting the stage for scenarios in Energy Futures 2017 that had scenarios regarding higher carbon price, as well as technology cases where we looked at how the cost of technologies might influence Canada's energy futures effectively. Then we have the Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act, setting the stage then for a more ambitious climate policy scenario in our evolving policy scenario, including 6 mini scenarios in the electricity space, where we modeled specifically what the electricity system would look like in a net zero future. And then building this internal capacity not only to do progressive scenarios, right, but scenarios that have a specific end in sight in terms of net zero emissions. And this is, it took us to the most recent Energy Futures 2023, where we had 2 full-scale energy scenarios where we had supply and demand through 2050 in a net zero framework for Canada. We obviously intend to continue to build on that iterative process and expertise that we have internally to conduct the future and next iteration of Energy Futures, and we'd be happy to hear your thoughts in terms of what would be helpful as a next iteration, because ultimately we rely extensively on engagement and transparency in how we conduct our work. We do this with a purpose to improve the analysis that we conduct, enhance the credibility of the work we do, and also enable people to better understand the premise of the scenarios, the assumptions we're making, so that stakeholders can rely upon those scenarios to conduct further analysis of their own. We're acknowledging that our scenarios are obviously at the national level, at a fairly high level compared to some more granular analysis that we have heard about today. And again, from a policymaking perspective, I think that there's value added in having an ability to see how an organization's work, how granular it may be, fits within the broader national energy landscape. In terms of ultimately how our analysis is used, I mean, it's obviously relied upon in a number of spaces, including academics and also some schools, essentially secondary school, where we have developed curriculums for teachers to use the type of information that we provide. We also see the scenarios that we develop being relied upon in regulatory proceedings for different types of energy infrastructure. For example, the Commission of the Commission of the Canada Energy Regulator will rely on our scenarios if it is presented on the record, and a party presenting it is actually able to answer to it. In the case of government policymaking specifically, our colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada will rely on some subset of our scenarios to provide oil and gas emissions for that sector specifically to the UNFCCC. We have seen also last week when the oil and gas emission cap, where there was more information published on that policy, that they had used one of our net zero scenarios. So the manner in which we, I think, can enable this kind of reliance is through close collaboration with NRCan, also Environment and Climate Change Canada, through different mechanisms of collaboration, so that we can make sure that the policy assumptions that we are modeling are as up to date as possible, and that there's also a mechanism to sort out issues as they come up. And also, as you can imagine, within a federal bureaucracy that doesn't like surprises, then it allows us to sort out those types of issues as we go along, and it essentially enable our organization to publish those scenarios in a way that is supported by the federal government, for which we are quite grateful. So in conclusion, the CR will obviously continue to publish timely and relevant energy information, and we intend to build upon the internal expertise that we have built on energy modeling to continue to model net zeros with additional aspects that are relevant and also in demand in terms of the feedback that we have heard in our engagement. We will also seek ongoing engagement with key stakeholders, including the modeling community, and happy to engage bilaterally with any of your organization to the extent that you have feedback on our work, and also we might actually reach out to actually leverage some of the expertise that you have. And I will close with that. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you this afternoon, and happy to take questions through the next phase of the session.
Thank you, Jean-Denis, for providing us the information about the process around the Energy Futures publications and describing that you are engaging experts, and you also acknowledge the various and diverse source of information that is already existing within the Canadian planning ecosystem. So with that, I would like to take questions. I see some questions already in the Mentimeters, but maybe I would like to use my privileged position as a moderator to ask a question first. So Ezat had mentioned that as a key success factor for the net zero, alignment of all levels of governments are quite useful, like key factor. And I think all the speakers somehow assume that this is really important. So I would like to ask all the speakers, what are the kind of key mechanisms to ensure that alignment, this kind of alignments are there, and what are the challenges that you see now? And maybe I would like to ask three speakers from the government sector. And Paul, if you also have some insights from the Irish experience, you can also tip in. So let me start from the left to the right.
Thank you. I think communication is very important. Models are a very useful tool to do that. Also being informed what other levels of government are working on, to be able to decide if what they're trying to do is going to be a supporting policy, or if it's going to actually maybe stall what you're trying to do, and based on that, engage to see what can be done about it.
Great, thanks.
All right, great question. I think one of the things that we want, and was kind of already mentioned, was just the open communication. And this communication needs to start from the beginning and not midway through, to kind of make sure that along the way decisions are being made where everyone is on board, because ultimately, as we're getting to a net zero Canada and like we're looking at electricity grid, every actor needs to be participating in this and rowing in the same direction so we can support this change. So open communication, having discussions where you go behind the scenes, kind of going under the hood and understanding what are the assumptions going into these models, what can be changed, undertaking sensitivity analysis together, and seeing how the modeling results compare, and then moving forward in an iterative approach.
Thank you so much. Chandani?
For us, it really goes through meaningful engagement. So yes, it's about communicating what we are doing and what we intend to do. And it's also about hearing back the feedback on those plans and assumptions to make sure that what we're doing actually meets the need of the audience and is also aligned with policy intent that is being either planned or being executed. So the key is really meaningful engagement. And there's different ways to go about this. Like obviously when we are, on a relatively tight schedule to execute an analysis, then we need to calibrate the manner in which we engage depending on the stakeholders. We obviously spend a bit more time and effort with federal colleagues, and we also open up through different means with provinces to ensure that we have a channel to hear feedback and input into the analysis that we're conducting.
Thanks. Paul, you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Sami. And I agree with Jean-Denis. I think those engagements are really important. There's different landing points for those engagements that we can encourage. Energy isn't just about electrons and molecules. It's about people, it's about employment, it's about health impacts, air pollution, water pollution, finances. So giving people access to our modeling via those hooks, making those opportunities and those benefits available and accessible, I think is important. In my experience, government is always very strong at working vertically, working up and down government, but when it comes to working across government, that's challenging. But I think we can help that by making that information available so governments can talk across. And I think that's a useful entry point for those engagements.
Thanks, Paul. We see one person. You can go ahead.
Hello, Stefan Schott, Carleton University. I have a question for Izzat and also for Peter, if I may. Quick question. Izzat, I think you mentioned that in order to be net zero, you need a carbon-free grid. So if I look at the IESO forecast for the grid, I see the natural gas is going up at 100% capacity down the road. So I wanted to know how Toronto can get around that. Will they decide only to take power from the grid when it's carbon-free, or will they try to get it through their own distributed systems? So that was one question. And for Peter, just a practical question. Your climate literacy courses, who will be delivering those? Sorry, from academia. So
Thank you. To answer your question, even if we deploy all the capacities that are possible for distributed energy resources, we would still need electricity from the grid. So we are not, we're tied to that. The only way we could reach net zero is through carbon offsets, which is less than ideal, but this is what we would have to do unless things change.
Perfect. Then I can talk about the climate literacy courses, which have been delivered to the Canadian Public Service. So the first one, Introduction to Climate Literacy Foundation, was by Dr. Sarah Birch from the University of Waterloo Climate Change Institute. Adapting to a Canadian Net Zero Economy was by Dr. James Meadowcroft at the Transition Accelerator in Carleton University. And lastly, Adapting to Climate in Canada was by Dr. Royal Roads University. Sorry, blanking on the name right now, but we do have
Thanks.
as well.
James is my colleague, I should know. Okay, thanks.
Okay, then maybe I just pick one or two questions from the Mentimeter. Maybe let me pick the question on the citizen engagement. This question is specifically to EZAT, but maybe this can be relevant for all the speakers. Jandini, you mentioned also about the engagement with experts, but like what's also the level of citizens engagement? Is that important or relevant? So maybe I can ask from left to right this time.
It is definitely important, and this is something that we have done through our Energy Futures 2023 process by putting out a discussion paper that allowed actually every Canadians the opportunity to understand the assumptions and the premise of the scenarios we're about to model and gave them an opportunity to provide comments to us. So we received about, I think, 60 submissions. So sure, it's not the degree of interest that we have sometimes on major pipeline infrastructure project, right? But at the same time, I think that's a good signal that yes, the public is interested, and we are open to hear from citizens. Also, going forward, we need to think about how to do this effectively and efficiently so that we can take into account how the energy transition would actually impact Canadian consumers, ratepayers, and Canadians in general. We've heard about concerns regarding the cost impact that the transition will have. So I think always keeping in mind how to best inform Canadians and also making sure that our analysis is helpful to them in making choices in their day-to-day lives.
Thank you so much. Peter?
I'll echo the words within the federal government. Anytime we're developing regulations, policies, or programs and developing strategies, there's always an open intake session, an area where citizens and governments and institutions can come together to put their thoughts and how these should be developed into practice. So these are all aggregated as well as considered, and as well as you'll definitely see within the news that is in a very public space where we get this feedback as well, but integrating it into how these strategies and plans are developed to ensure that everyone is on board as much as possible.
So with the city, it's similar to the others. Whenever there's something, there has to be a public engagement with this in different formats. So there's the very basic things that the city always does regarding anything. Now, specifically when it comes to the climate, there is a climate advisory group that where we have participants from different groups in the city, professionals, experts that meet on a quarterly basis to provide their what they've heard from the community and the people around them, but also to hear what the plans are and what we're working on. So it's a two-way communication.
Okay, great. Paul, you might also have lots of experience from this public engagement. Why it's so important from your perspective? Can you share your insights?
Yeah, thank you, Asami. I think fundamentally good communication is really about listening. It's about listening to the concerns that the public have, about their questions, their queries, And that listening is important because that allows us to become better modelers. It allows us to ask better questions of our models and to produce better information. So I think listening is a huge part of it. The traditional role of engineering here in Europe, 40 years ago, engineers just told people what the answer was and waited for them to stop speaking and then did it. That does not work anymore. So listening, asking, and understanding is a huge part of communication. I think telling is less effective, but when we listen, we can improve our models, improve our communication, and it's very important. Very few people are against reducing climate pollution. Very few people are against reducing our reliance to exposure to geopolitics here in Europe. So it's just a matter of finding, again, those entry points. Not everybody, the challenge we find with climate change communication is that you cannot see greenhouse gases. You cannot touch it. You cannot taste it. You see the consequences of it on television, so, and it's frightening. But finding different ways to talk to people is an important part of our practice. It makes us better at modelers. It takes time, but I think it's fundamentally important in terms of sharing our stories and sharing the choices that we have towards the future.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I would like to start wrapping up. Maybe I would like to ask each one of you to say a few last words. Maybe I would like to ask colleagues sitting here, because here we have mixture of people, particularly scientific communities is here. What do you want from scientific community? How does the scientific community can help your work? And then to Paul, the opposite question from the scientific community, what do you want from the government planners? Who wanna take first?
Well, I can get started. So what we want from government, well, that's a bit tricky, from where I sit. Sustainable funding, right? Sustainable funding, and also a continuation of respecting the governance of the system. I've never seen any issues with that. And I think preserving the health of the governance system, respecting roles and responsibilities, including the independence of not only the regulator but our energy information function, I think has been very positive so far. And continuing to do this going forward, I think, is very key to the success of the federal machinery. The second piece about what would benefit, how would we benefit from the scientific community, I think ongoing engagement, that really is by cross-pollination of ideas. Also challenges in our work will help us, modelers, energy analysts, to be better. And again, because of where we sit, then the better we are, I think the better the government is informed in decision-making.
Thank you. Peter?
To the scientific community who engages with governments, one of the things we want is that active, ongoing collaboration and communication. There's a lot of very unique research areas that only they can undertake, and we want to have that being done because there are limits to what can be included in one model and across models. There's a question on the stage about biodiversity and reconciliation considered in these models, and some of this cannot be done. So having the research being undertaken at large and communicated in a way that can be used or at least brought to the stage to have a conversation on is what I'd like from the scientific community.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very close to what Peter just said in terms of the community is already doing a great job. There's a lot more that can be done. It's about how making the models even better, because every model, like Peter said, has some assumptions that are built in it and some limitations. And unfortunately, sometimes those limitations become a hurdle in terms of decision making because, well, we don't know what would happen because we assumed this, so everything stops. So that crossing that hurdle and in terms of refining the models would definitely be very helpful.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Sami. In terms of what government can do for scientific researchers, I think capacity building is fundamentally important. And I know Irina do a lot of really good work in this area, but capacity building within countries is so integral to the institutional memory that countries build up around climate literacy, about dealing with big problems. If you don't have that capacity, within your country, it tends to get you become more reliant on large consultancies, and that's okay. But they'll charge you for it, and they'll take away the information afterwards. You want that info, and that's just the way the world works. But each country should really encourage its own capacity building through scholarships, through academia, and again, it comes down to funding. Funding is incredibly important for the scientific community to maintain that capacity. But I think once you have capacity, you can solve a lot of problems and you can contribute in very positive ways.
Okay, thank you so much. So please join me thanking all the speakers.